Welcome to the Sharkpreneur podcast with Kevin Harrington and Seth Greene. Kevin Harrington is the inventor of the infomercial, one of the original sharks from the hit TV show Shark Tank, and has generated over $5 billion in TV and digital direct response sales. Seth Greene is the world's first trusted authority on cutting-edge direct response marketing, a best-selling author, and the only 3-time Marketer of the Year nominee. On the podcast, Kevin and Seth interview sharkpreneurs who share straight talk on what it takes to explode your business.
49 faces looked to him in triumph. Over the last 12 months, they had each taken turns and promoted his business for a week at a time, driving over $987,342 in revenue. What if you had a network of 50 centers of influence who promoted your business every week for a year? Grab your copy of the #1 Amazon best-selling book, The Ultimate Guide to Growing Your Business with a Podcast, at 33% off the Amazon price by going to ultimatepodcastbook.com. Again, that website for 33% off the Amazon price is ultimatepodcastbook.com. Welcome to the podcast. This is your host for today, Seth Greene. Today, I've got the good fortune to be with David C. Barnett, who is a seasoned business transaction advisor, author, and international speaker who specializes in guiding entrepreneurs through the complex processes of buying, selling, and valuing small to mid-sized businesses. He is the creator of the Business Buyer Advantage and How to Sell My Own Business programs, along with the book Buying versus Starting a Small Business, a guide to keep you from going broke. David, thank you so much for joining us.
Seth, thanks for inviting me on. How are you today?
I am awesome. Thank you for asking. Let's go back in time a little bit. How did you get started?
Wow, it's a long question. I'm one of those lifelong entrepreneur types, and I had the good fortune of going to business school thinking that it would turn me into a business person, but then later realized that what they do there is they turn people into these, what I now call Fortune 500 bureaucrats, like being a cog in a big machine. And so I really got my in-depth small business education when I was an account rep for the Yellow Pages, because it was my job to go out and meet with the owners and managers of all the small businesses that you see when you're driving around your city. And that's when I got to learn, what kind of customers they were looking for, how they made money, et cetera. And I was able to bring that experience eventually into the world of business brokerage after a little detour in the world of entrepreneurship and being a commercial loan broker too. So both of which helped me tremendously in the business brokerage world.
Awesome. So, and I'm sure the longer version of that story is probably in one of the books somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. I get into my background all the time and share experiences when I'm making videos on my YouTube channel or when I'm writing about stories of things that happened. I actually was doing an update to one of my books that I came out in 2015, Franchise Warnings, and sort of adding some additional stories and some of the things that have happened over the last 10 years. And I really dip into my experience as much as possible to share real life examples of things that I've seen happen to people when they've gotten involved in different deals, in this case for franchises.
Awesome. Well, let's dive in. What are some of the most common and costly mistakes business owners make when trying to sell their business?
Yeah, so the biggest one is not pricing it correctly. And there's two ways that people do this. They either make some kind of error in determining what the enterprise value is of the business. And we often talk about people who will apply some kind of multiple factor to the cash flow of their business. But the next question then is, well, what do you get for that? And this is where a lot of people will make a mistake because they'll just make assumptions about what things are included or not included in that enterprise value. And if there's a large operating capital or net working capital component to the business and they don't properly factor that into their assessment, what they end up doing is they end up overpricing the business by the amount of additional capital a buyer needs to put in. In either case, when you significantly overprice the business, you chase away the qualified buyers, and who you're left with are other people who similarly don't know what they're doing. And so you can end up wasting sometimes years. And then eventually like that has an impact on the business operations, has an impact on you. If sales start to turn down or earnings turn down, it can have an impact on the value of the business. Usually when people put a business up for sale, there's some pressing personal concern requiring them to move on. And so I like to say that if you've come to a point where you need to sell and you do not have an heir apparent that you've developed yourself, then time is of the essence. You need to properly price it so you can meet the right buyer and get that transition and handover happening before those personal concerns start to have an impact on the operation of the business and on the results. Because as soon as things start to have a downward trend, everybody will get very anxious about your numbers and your business, and it becomes that much harder to do a deal.
It's fascinating that you talk about overpricing, repelling the right buyers and attracting the wrong ones who don't know what they're doing. I never would have thought of that. I would have thought underpricing would have been a bigger problem. You alluded to the time factor. How do you help clients determine the right time to sell their business? Assuming that there isn't like a divorce, a death, an illness that makes it have to sell now.
Yeah, so the only circumstance that I've seen where people have a choice of when they exit is if they are planning a retirement, or they, have come to the realization, hey, over the next few years I want to get out of this and do something else. Because here's the thing that a lot of people miss. There's no real good reason to sell a good profitable business. People think about selling a business and they think about stories like Mark Zuckerberg selling some stock in Facebook. And those stories, there's a cashing out scenario. There's an incredible wealth that's been created through the business. For most small businesses, we don't have that kind of scenario. We're talking about businesses that are valued at multiples that are like, 2.5, 3 times cash flow. Nobody gets excited about that. In fact, most sellers, when I show them what their business is worth, they will say something to the effect of, oh, I could just have that money if I stayed and ran it for a few years and I'd still own the business. And they're absolutely correct. Businesses that are good and profitable, these small businesses, are always worth more to the sellers than to the buyers, because the sellers have paid down debts, they're enjoying that cash flow. They know what's going on, and they can live with the risks of operations because they understand the business. The buyer, on the other hand, they're leveraging up with a lot of debt. They don't understand the business to the same extent that the seller does, and they see risk and problems everywhere. And eventually, a buyer and seller that are both willing will come to some kind of an agreement and transact. Most of the sellers, though, are, not very happy about it. They're not getting that cash out moment that they may have been led to believe they might get from some of the stories that are out there in the media. So as far as timing goes, you asked the question about when to sell. The key is that you sell when you need to sell, and you can only really sell for a reasonable price if the business is prepared to be sold. And so what that means is having the processes and systems and everything in place, and the proper financials so that people can get a good view into what's actually going on in the business. If a business is truly, truly, truly prepared with all the systems and everything, then you get these people who kind of step back and they continue to own it even though they kind of semi-retire. And that is a really privileged kind of position to be in that not many business owners ever achieve. But if you take this preparation to the ultimate extent, you can actually enjoy ownership for an even longer stretch of time, and really reduce the amount of hours that you put into it. So I always tell people, get ready to sell, because the value of your business is increased through higher cash flow, and the saleability of the business is increased through your systems and organization. And if you work on both of those things, you get to enjoy a better business while you still own it. So there's really no reason not to work on those things.
Amen to that. I mean, we obviously want people to go get it, but can you walk us through a little bit of your how to sell my own business system and what set it apart from like a traditional broker-led process?
Yeah, so I used to be a broker, and when I was a business broker, people would list their business with me. I would do an evaluation. I would prepare a buyer facing document. I would do an ad program, and at the end, when the transaction successfully occurred, then I would get a commission. And what I uh, decided to change is, I said, you know what, we can remodel the way that this is done, and we can make it into more of a piecemeal kind of consulting business, and that's what I've done. And so I'm able to help more people in different scenarios. So now what we do is we do an evaluation and we charge people for that. If they want us to prepare the buyer facing documentation, we do it and we charge them for it. If they want us to run an ad campaign, we do that and we charge them for it. We also give some advisory services and coaching along the way if they'd like that. And so by breaking it up into individual pieces, what ends up happening is people will pay us for what we do. There's no commission at the end, but we will help people that have different scenarios. We often get approached by people who have a long-time employee, for example, and the employee has expressed an interest in buying. What they really need is just someone to do a valuation on the business and coach the two of them through the process and see if it's a possible thing to do. and give them some guidance. And so we help people in those kinds of scenarios too. We focus on what I refer to as the Main Street and lower middle market. When we start to get north of, you know, six, seven, $800,000 in EBITDA, I really do encourage people to get advice and help from a full service broker, just because you're starting to talk about a very different kind of transaction with a different level of qualification and sophistication amongst the buyers. And I think people really can benefit from the value of someone who's an expert in that space. With the smaller ones, you know, business owners often complain that they're underserved by some elements of the business brokerage community. And so we've found our sweet spot amongst people that feel that they can kind of do it themselves, but they want some help. They want to really know that they're on the right track, and they want to make sure that their expectations are set correctly. And if there's something really wrong, you know, you mentioned when I should sell my business. We do the evaluation part for some people years before they anticipate selling, and we can often uncover things that can be addressed. We had a case recently where a gentleman was in a certain industry. Part of our evaluation is a benchmarking analysis, and we showed him that his gross profits were 6% lower than the industry benchmark. And I asked him, I said, "What's the problem? Do you pay too much for your inputs, or are your prices too low?" And the thing is he knew the answer. Like he knew he like a lot of business owners, he's been successful for a long time. He's got a good cash flow. He's paid off his debts. He doesn't have the same forces pressuring him to constantly hustle and grind and you know, raise prices and do all those things. And so it starts to slip. And so I showed him, I said, if your margins were industry average, this is what your bottom line would look like, and this is how it would affect your value. And so he's working on that over the next 2 years. He wants to improve the business. It's going to become more valuable and ultimately easier to sell. And like I said earlier, Seth, he's going to get to enjoy those profits between now and then.
Awesome. What trends are you seeing in the private business sale market these days?
Yeah. So the big trend is that there are still people who remember when interest rates were next to zero, and they're still trying to get the kinds of prices for their small businesses that people were getting back then. And it's funny because they're willing to do a lot to get the price, Seth. Like I'm seeing sellers willing to carry larger and larger seller notes at lower and lower interest rates. Effectively, they're offsetting the finance cost from the senior secured debt, but they're just trying to contort the deal into such a way that the buyer can still afford it and they can still tell their buddies they got that, you know, sort of aspirational dollar number out of the deal. It's, you know, all businesses ultimately pay for themselves. You know, the buyer is going to bring some kind of down payment, they're going to finance part of it, and the business has to be able to service that debt. And I think that as interest rates stay higher for longer, and you know the pool of people willing to pay those higher prices diminishes over time, ultimately the pricing is going to have to start coming back down because people just can't make the deals work otherwise.
That makes a lot of sense. You've helped hundreds and hundreds of entrepreneurs. What's the one piece of advice you give every business owner preparing for sale?
Yeah, it's to put some thought into who the buyer is likely going to be and what their position is likely going to be. And this is where the sort of I talk a lot about seller empathy. A lot of business owners will think a lot about their customers and their customers' needs, but when they go to sell their business, they suddenly become very self-centered. They think about the money they're going to get, the things they want to buy, the new vacation home, the villa, the RV, whatever it is. And what you have to do is you have to think about the business buyer acquiring your business as though it were a piece of inventory. What is their position going to be? What are they going to be going through? This can help people with the overpricing problem. So I've often said, if you have a, you know, small restaurant, chances are the buyer is going to be someone from the hospitality industry, someone who's a waiter, chef, whatever. And that person probably hasn't had a high income. And so don't expect that they're going to have a really big down payment. They're probably going to maybe even have trouble accessing credit. And so if that's the kind of business you have to sell, you're going to have to be more open to flexible terms, more seller financing, et cetera. If you have, you know, a larger business and if you think it's going to be a strategic acquisition, then maybe you can think about a buyer that's going to have more resources coming into the deal. But really put some thought into who the buyer is going to be. And the media in this space, they love to hit home on things like private equity groups, ESOPs, like all of these very fancy kinds of transactions. And the reality is that the vast majority of small businesses are sold to individual entrepreneurs who are likely going to step in and operate them. And that's the one kind of buyer that people should really think about when they're thinking about their transaction is who would that person likely be? How am I going to find them? And what are their resources likely going to be? And how will I help show them that I'm going to be able to help them transition into this operation so that they can take over from what I do?
That makes a lot of sense. We know your time is incredibly valuable. We greatly appreciate you spending some of it with us. For our folks watching or listening, where is the best place to go learn about David C. Barnett and all the books?
Yeah, sure. So my blog site is davidcbarnett.com, and that's kind of the central nervous system of everything I do. And if you're just interested in learning more about deals, go to YouTube or any podcast application, just type David Barnett Small Business, and you'll find me. I just celebrated my 11th year on YouTube, and all those audios are on the podcast track too. So there's literally thousands of hours of content all about deal making, and a lot of it is just answering people's questions that they send in.
All right. Well, we greatly appreciate your time. Again, this has been Seth Greene with David C. Barnett. David, thanks again for joining us.
Thanks, Seth. It's been a great time.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us. We'll talk to you or see you next time.
Why do so many businesses struggle while others seem to explode overnight? Do you wish you had the secret to this type of exponential growth? Now, I've scaled more than 20 businesses to over $100 million, and it's not just luck. In my new book with Mark Tim, Mentor to Millions, you'll learn the repeatable framework I use in all my business ventures for massive success. Order at kevinmentor.com and get over $1,000 in bonuses. Head to kevinmentor.com.